Saturday mornings in my neighborhood usually meant birdsong, coffee, and the faint groan of lawnmowers starting up 2 streets away. But not this one. This one began with a sound that made my stomach twist, the steady rising wail of the county's weather siren cutting out mid-blast, replaced by a choked hum, and then silence. I knew instantly what that meant. Someone had tampered with the siren. And given that the control box sat at the corner of my lot, 10 feet from the fence line, I also knew exactly who had both the motive and the gall. Karen. Karen, queen of the HOA board, self-appointed arbiter of neighborhood aesthetics, and the kind of woman who treated other people's property like extensions of her own, had been ranting for months about how the ugly gray pole ruined her view of the cul-de-sac. The fact that it was a federally maintained tornado siren, wired directly into the county's emergency system, didn't matter to her. She wanted it gone. She had brought it up at 3 HOA meetings, tried to rally a petition, and even threatened to contact her senator. When none of that worked, I guess she decided to take matters into her own hands. I walked down my driveway with my mug in hand, pretending calm. The cut cord dangled like a severed vein from the metal box, the copper wires frayed and sparking faintly where she'd yanked them apart. And there she was, on her porch across the street, robe tied loose, sipping from a wine glass at 8 in the morning like she had just declared victory in some suburban Cold War. She saw me staring and raised her glass in a mock salute. "Looks better already, don't you think?" she called, voice dripping smugness. I could have shouted. I could have marched across the street and unleashed every word I'd been holding back for years of her nonsense, about the time she blocked my driveway with her Lexus because her driveway was too wet to park on, or when she filed a noise complaint because my Christmas lights had an aggressive flicker. But I didn't. Instead, I sipped my coffee, turned on my heel, and went inside. If there was one thing I'd learned living under Karen's petty dictatorship, it was that patience always paid off. 15 minutes later, my patience paid dividends. A black SUV rolled slowly into the cul-de-sac, unmarked but heavy in presence. Then another. The neighborhood curtains twitched. Kids on bikes scattered. Karen, sensing attention, strutted down her steps as though Homeland Security had arrived to present her with a medal. She even smoothed her robe and straightened her wine glass, like she wanted to look good for the cameras that weren't there. But the agents weren't here for a ribbon cutting. They moved with precision, one heading directly to the siren, another scanning the street, 2 more stepping toward Karen. She tried her smile first. "Oh, thank goodness you're here. I was just telling everyone how unsafe that dreadful noise-polluting siren was. I've been advocating for its removal for months." Finally, someone listened. The lead agent didn't even blink. He held up a clipboard with a photo, her, in fuzzy clarity, cutting the cord with what looked like her husband's bolt cutters. I hadn't even noticed the county had cameras mounted on the pole, but of course they did. Homeland Security didn't play around with infrastructure. Karen's smile faltered. "Now wait just a minute. This is a misunderstanding. I was doing the community a favor. That thing was a hazard. My nephew couldn't sleep with it going off during tests." The agent's voice was calm but unyielding. "Ma'am, tampering with federal emergency equipment is a felony offense. This siren is part of a national warning system. Cutting its power endangers not only this neighborhood, but the entire county. You will need to come with us." Karen's face cycled through disbelief, outrage, and then the kind of practiced indignation only she could muster. "How dare you accuse me? I am the HOA president. I have authority over neighborhood fixtures. That box is on our covenant land." I leaned casually against my porch railing, watching the show unfold, sipping what was now lukewarm coffee but still tasting like victory. Neighbors peeked out in clusters now, some filming with phones. For once, I wasn't the one in Karen's crosshairs. Her last gambit was pure theater. She threw her wine glass down, shards scattering across the sidewalk, and screamed, "This is harassment. I know my rights." The agent signaled, and 2 more stepped forward. Calm, efficient, unshaken. Karen was not cuffed, At least not yet, but she was escorted firmly back toward her porch where they began questioning her. She flailed her arms, waving toward me. This is his fault. He's been targeting me for years. He probably sabotaged it himself to frame me. I raised my mug in silent salute, the way she had earlier. The agent didn't even look my way. That was the thing about Karen. She always believed her entitlement could bend reality to her will. She thought HOA bylaws outweighed federal law. She thought her complaints were more important than public safety. She thought she could cut a cord and silence a system designed to save lives. And now she was realizing that sometimes, just sometimes, the world outside our cul-de-sac noticed. As they continued questioning her, I went inside and set my mug in the sink. I knew this was only the beginning. Karen never admitted defeat. She would fight tooth and nail, drag the rest of the neighborhood into it, and twist the story until she looked like a martyr. That was her power, not the actual control she wielded, but the chaos she could stir. And sure enough, my phone buzzed with a notification from the neighborhood app within the hour. A post from Karen, unjustly targeted by government overreach, neighbors beware. It was going to be a long week, and I was ready. The cul-de-sac had always thrived on gossip, but after the black SUVs left Karen's driveway, the entire neighborhood was practically foaming at the mouth. You could feel it in the way curtains snapped closed too fast, the way groups of dog walkers slowed conspicuously by her mailbox, pretending to tie leashes while eavesdropping. Everyone had seen Karen being walked back inside by federal agents, and though no handcuffs had appeared, her face had been red enough to suggest they hadn't exactly offered her champagne and finger sandwiches. I should have savored the moment in peace, but that wasn't Karen's style. By afternoon, she was already on offense. A typed, printed, and underlined flyer appeared in every mailbox, her preferred propaganda method. The bold headline read, "Emergency Equipment Sabotage, a Neighborhood Frame-Up." I had to admire her creativity. She was already rewriting history, declaring herself the victim of some shadowy vendetta, hinting heavily that I was the puppet master pulling federal strings. Certain individuals, the flyer read, have long sought to humiliate me. This outrageous incident is nothing but their attempt to destroy the democratic authority of your HOA leadership. Democratic authority. That was rich. Karen had won her presidency when nobody else wanted the job. The vote had been her husband, and the guy down the block who thought it was funny to scribble Kermit the Frog as a write-in candidate. Yet she acted like she'd been sworn in on the Capitol step. I could have laughed it off, but Karen was good at one thing, rallying discontent. By sunset, she had a small audience gathered in her yard, nodding along as she explained how the federal government had been misled by neighbors with an agenda. She had props this time. Photographs of the siren pole, cropped carefully to avoid showing the severed wires in her hands, printouts of HOA bylaws, and a megaphone she'd borrowed from God knows where. I watched from my porch as she barked through it. This so-called siren is a relic of Cold War paranoia, placed without proper neighborhood consent. It disrupts property values, ruins the serenity of our streets, and, get this, costs our community thousands in hidden maintenance fees. That last part was pure fiction. The county paid for every bolt and battery. But half the neighborhood didn't know that, and Karen's talent was exploiting ignorance. I decided to attend, partly for the theater, partly because I couldn't resist poking the bear. I strolled over, hands in pockets, and joined the back of the crowd. She spotted me instantly. "Well, well," she sneered through the megaphone, her voice cracking with feedback, "if it isn't the puppet master himself. Did you enjoy your little stunt this morning, calling your friends at Homeland Security on your HOA president?" The crowd murmured. All eyes shifted to me. For once, I didn't rush to defend myself. Instead, I gave her the smile of a man holding cards no one else could see. "Karen," I said evenly, "Homeland Security doesn't exactly take neighborhood suggestions. They showed up because someone tampered with federal infrastructure. You're lucky they didn't bring handcuffs. Her face tightened, but she wasn't about to let the performance slip. Neighbors, do you hear the veiled threats? This is intimidation. Exactly what I've been warning you about. He wants to control this neighborhood, to silence our voices. The irony of her claiming silencing, after literally cutting the cord on a warning siren, nearly made me laugh out loud. But I kept my calm. Karen, I said, projecting my voice so everyone could hear, when the next tornado sweeps through here, do you want to explain to emergency crews why your actions kept families from getting a warning? That landed. Heads turned. A mother with a stroller frowned. An older couple exchanged a nervous glance. Safety was one thing Karen couldn't spin without cracks forming. She quickly tried to patch. The county has phone alerts. Weather apps. Why should we tolerate an eyesore blaring in our ears when modern technology exists? This was Karen's specialty, confuse the issue with half-truths. Yes, phones blared alerts. But the sirens were backup, crucial for power outages and people asleep or outdoors. She didn't care about logic, only about winning the narrative. I knew I needed to up the stakes, so I pulled out my phone and opened the county website I had bookmarked earlier. With a couple of taps, I projected the page toward the group. Tampering with or disabling warning sirens is a federal crime punishable by fines up to $250,000 and imprisonment up to 5 years. The crowd leaned closer. Karen's face drained of color, then flushed red again. Photoshopped, she snapped. That's fake news. But the words rang hollow. Everyone could see the .gov domain at the top of my screen. Some started whispering. One man coughed awkwardly and slipped away. Another woman folded her arms, clearly rethinking her allegiance. Karen's voice wavered, but she powered on. This is persecution. They're trying to strip us of our rights as homeowners. If we let them take the siren today, what will they take tomorrow? Our fences? Our gardens? Our freedom? Classic Karen. Jump straight from tornado sirens to the Bill of Rights. But I'd done enough for the night. I gave the crowd a small shrug and turned back toward my house. Let her spin. The cracks were forming, and I knew it. Later, as dusk settled, I heard the faint sound of shouting from Karen's porch. Not to the neighbors this time, but to her husband. His voice was low, sharp, and angrier than I'd ever heard. It seemed not everyone under her roof bought her martyr act. By midnight, the neighborhood app lit up again, an anonymous post, though the style was unmistakable. Certain neighbors are conspiring to destroy this community. Beware of wolves in sheep's clothing. The truth will prevail. I almost replied, but stopped myself. Why waste words when the government already had eyes on her? Why argue when her paranoia would do most of the work for me? The next morning, 2 more black SUVs returned, this time with county officials in tow. Karen came storming out in full makeup, like she'd prepped for a press conference. But they weren't here for debate. They were here to install a temporary replacement siren. This one bigger, louder, and mounted higher on the pole. The first test blast rattled windows. Dogs barked across the cul-de-sac. Kids screamed. And Karen, standing on her porch with her robe flapping like a defeated general, covered her ears and screamed louder than all of them. That was when I realized something. The real storm hadn't even started yet. Karen wasn't going to back down. She was going to escalate. And in a war between her ego and federal law, the neighborhood was about to become the battlefield. And I was more than ready to watch it unfold. The third morning after Karen's little performance with the siren cord, I woke up to find my front yard covered in flyers again. Same neon paper she favored, same blocky font that looked like she'd printed them on her office copier at 2 in the morning. This time, the headline screamed, "Illegal Federal Occupation of HOA Land." The rest was a wall of paranoia about how the government had installed unauthorized equipment and how neighbors must stand united to protect their property rights. She even added a signature line at the bottom, urging people to sign the petition to demand removal of the illegal siren. What struck me wasn't the content. Karen had been ranting in caps lock before caps lock was even a thing. It was the sheer volume. There had to be at least 200 flyers. My yard looked like a parade route after the floats had gone by. And it wasn't just me. As I walked down the street to grab coffee from the corner shop, I saw yards littered with the same paper, porch steps covered, mailboxes stuffed. One poor guy had his car windshield plastered with them under the wipers. Karen wasn't going to let her humiliation sit. She was doubling down. I wasn't surprised when, that evening, she called an emergency HOA meeting at the clubhouse. Normally, 5 people showed up, top. But this time, the place was packed. Word travels fast when federal SUVs roll down your street. Curious neighbors wanted answers, drama seekers wanted a show, and I just wanted front row seating to watch Karen's delusions collapse under their own weight. She strutted to the podium in a blazer and pearls, every inch the self-appointed politician, clutching a stack of papers like they were sacred documents. Behind her, taped to the wall, was a blown-up photo of the siren pole with "illegal" stamped across it in red marker. "Friends, neighbors," she began, voice trembling with righteous fury, "we are under siege. Our quiet, beautiful neighborhood has been invaded by outside forces who claim authority over us. They planted that monstrosity without our consent, and now they accuse me, of wrongdoing simply because I acted in the interest of our community." Murmurs spread through the room. A few nodded in agreement, but most looked skeptical. Still, Karen pressed on. "They say I tampered with federal property. But what is federal property? Land is land, and our HOA owns the easement where that pole stands. That makes it our property. And as your HOA president, I have the duty to protect it." I raised my hand. She ignored me, of course. So I stood up. "Karen," I said, voice calm but loud enough to carry, "you cut the cord to a tornado siren. It doesn't matter who owns the dirt under it. The equipment is federal, period. That's not just my opinion, that's the law. And you knew it." The room went quiet. Karen's lips curled into a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "And here we have it, neighbors. The so-called victim, who just happens to live next to the pole, trying to scare us with legal jargon. Who's to say he didn't cut it himself? Who's to say he hasn't been colluding with the county to drive down our property values so he can buy us out cheap?" There it was. The conspiracy theory. I'd half expected it. Karen couldn't just be wrong. She needed to cast herself as a hero battling invisible enemies. A voice from the crowd interrupted. It was Mrs. Jameson, the 70-year-old widow who'd lived here since before most of us were born. "Karen," she said firmly, "when the tornado came through in '08, that siren saved lives. Mine included. If you think I'll sign some fool petition to get rid of it, you've lost your mind." Applause broke out. Not everyone joined in, but enough to rattle Karen. She banged her fist on the podium. "You've been deceived. Don't you see? This is how tyranny begins." Another neighbor spoke up. "Tyranny begins when you think cutting safety equipment makes you the good guy." The meeting unraveled fast after that. Karen tried to shout over objections, her husband tried to restore order, but the crowd had tasted blood. People weren't buying her martyr act. By the end, the only signatures on her petition were her own, her husband's, and one confused guy who thought he was signing up for free pizza. I thought maybe, just maybe, Karen would retreat after that. I should have known better. The next day, I woke to hammering sounds outside. At first I assumed it was construction, but when I looked out, I nearly spit out my coffee. Karen and her husband were erecting a wooden fence, 6 feet tall, around the siren pole. They'd actually sunk posts into the ground overnight and were already halfway done. I walked over, phone in hand. "Karen, what are you doing?" She barely looked up. "Exercising our property rights. The HOA has authority over all fixtures in this neighborhood. If the government wants to keep their toy, they can ask permission properly." I took a video. "You're building a fence around federal equipment. Do you realize how insane that sounds?" She smirked. "Insane? Or brilliant? Let's see how quickly they fold when they can't access it without trespassing. It was like watching a child pile blocks higher and higher, daring gravity to intervene. And intervene it did, just not in the way she expected. 2 hours later, a county truck rolled up with technicians. They saw the fence, shook their heads, and called someone. Within half an hour, the SUVs returned. This time, the agents didn't bother with long explanations. They cut the padlock she'd just installed, dismantled 2 panels of her fence, and walked right in. Karen stormed out screaming about illegal demolition of HOA property. One agent handed her a cease and desist order. Another handed her a fine. And me? I leaned against my porch railing, capturing the whole thing on video, already knowing exactly where I'd be posting it later. The best part wasn't even the confrontation. It was the moment Karen realized she'd lost control of the crowd. Neighbors stood at the edges of their yards, watching, some laughing, some recording. The tide had turned, and she knew it. But if there was one thing about Karen, it was that she never surrendered. That night, another post hit the neighborhood app. Emergency HOA vote tomorrow. Agenda: reclaiming authority from outside forces. She was planning her next escalation. And judging by her track record, it was going to be bigger, louder, and far messier than anyone was prepared for. I went to bed knowing one thing. If she thought Homeland Security showing up was the climax, she was about to discover just how wrong she could be. By the time Karen announced her emergency HOA vote, the cul-de-sac was buzzing like a hornet's nest. She had stapled notices to every telephone pole, slipped leaflets under doors, and even shouted the news through her megaphone while pacing up and down the sidewalk like a one-woman parade. To hear her tell it, the fate of democracy itself hung in the balance. What she was really after was obvious: leverage. She couldn't win against Homeland Security, so she was trying to reclaim control over the only empire she thought she could rule: the HOA. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. in the clubhouse. I arrived early, mostly for the entertainment value, and found her already there, flanked by her husband and her loyal sidekick Sharon, the treasurer who once fined me $50 because my recycling bin lid didn't close all the way. Karen had gone full politician this time. Power suit, flag pin, stacks of paper arranged dramatically on the table in front of her. She had even set up a podium with a microphone that wasn't connected to anything, purely for optics. Neighbors trickled in, some curious, some rolling their eyes, and a few clearly there for popcorn. By the time the clock hit 7, nearly every chair was filled. Karen wasted no time. She banged a wooden gavel she must have bought off Amazon and launched straight into her speech. "Fellow homeowners," she began, her voice pitched high with faux urgency, "we have suffered an unprecedented violation of our community's sovereignty. Our land, our peace, and our rights have been trampled by outside forces who believe they can do whatever they wish. The siren pole represents government overreach, and the so-called cease and desist order was nothing but intimidation." She held up the paper Homeland Security had handed her, waving it like a bloody flag. "Tonight we vote to assert our independence. We will pass a resolution declaring the siren unauthorized, and we will demand its removal. If they refuse, we will sue." The room buzzed with murmurs. A few people clapped, but most exchanged uneasy glances. I raised my hand. Karen, predictably, ignored me until I stood up. "Karen," I said evenly, "you can pass as many HOA resolutions as you want. It doesn't change the fact that the siren is federal property. Suing Homeland Security is like throwing rocks at a tank. All you'll accomplish is draining HOA funds on legal bills." Gasps rippled through the room. People hadn't thought about the money. Karen tried to recover. "What is money compared to liberty?" she cried. A voice from the back cut her off. It was Mr. Hernandez, a quiet engineer who rarely spoke. "Liberty doesn't pay the fines. Are you planning to cover those with your own checkbook, Karen?" Laughter erupted. Karen flushed crimson. "This is no laughing matter. If we don't act, they'll keep taking more. Today it's a siren. Tomorrow it could be our yards, our homes. Or your wine budget, someone muttered. More laughter. The cracks in her armor widened. She slammed her gavel. Enough. We will proceed with the vote. Ballots were passed out, simple slips of paper marked yes or no. Karen watched the room like a hawk as people scribbled. When the votes were tallied, the result was undeniable. 38 no, 7 yes. Her resolution had failed spectacularly. For a moment she just stood there, stunned. Then her expression hardened. This vote is invalid. It was influenced by misinformation and fear. We'll reconvene tomorrow. Groans filled the room. People started leaving, shaking their heads. Karen had overplayed her hand, and everyone knew it. But if she was cornered, she was also dangerous. That was when I realized she wasn't going to stop with politics. She was going to take direct action again. I was right. 2 nights later, at around midnight, I heard noises outside. I crept to my window and saw flashlights bobbing near the siren pole. Karen and her husband were there, along with Sharon. They had brought a ladder, tools, and what looked suspiciously like bolt cutters again. They were actually trying to dismantle the replacement siren. I dialed the county hotline immediately. By the time I slipped on shoes and went outside, headlights were already sweeping into the cul-de-sac. 2 county trucks and, moments later, another unmarked SUV. Karen froze halfway up the ladder, a wrench in her hand. Her husband dropped the bolt cutters like they were radioactive. Sharon bolted for her car. The agents stepped out, this time less patient. "Ma'am, you are in direct violation of a federal cease and desist order," one said firmly. Karen's voice cracked but carried the same defiance. "This is HOA property. We voted." "No," the agent interrupted, "your neighbors voted against you. And tampering again, after a federal warning, isn't just a citation. It's arrestable." The neighborhood woke fast. Porch lights flicked on, blinds cracked open, phones came out. Half the cul-de-sac was filming as Karen was pulled down from the ladder and placed in handcuffs. Her shrieking echoed across the street. "This is tyranny. I am your president. You'll all regret this." Her husband tried to intervene, but when an agent picked up the bolt cutters and showed him the evidence, he went silent. Sharon, meanwhile, had locked herself in her car, watching wide-eyed as if debating whether to drive away or pretend she wasn't part of it. The agents loaded Karen into the SUV and drove off, sirens flashing once before cutting silent. The cul-de-sac was left in stunned quiet, broken only by the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog and the whisper of disbelief spreading through the crowd. I stood there with my phone in hand, still recording, when Mr. Hernandez came up beside me. He shook his head slowly. "She finally did it. She finally went too far." I nodded. "She always thought rules didn't apply to her. Now she gets to test that theory with federal law." By morning, the neighborhood app exploded. Half the posts were neighbors sharing videos of the arrest. The other half were Karen's allies trying desperately to spin it as government persecution. But the tide had turned. Most people had seen enough. Still, I knew Karen wasn't gone for good. She'd post bail, come back, and find some new angle to claw her way back into control. That was her nature. She didn't quit, she escalated. Sure enough, by afternoon, her husband was back, sulking on their porch. A new post appeared online under her account. "Released on bond. Legal battle ahead. Neighbors who side with tyranny will be remembered." It was half threat, half promise. And though most ignored it, I couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was only gathering force. Karen had always fought dirty. If she couldn't win with votes, and she couldn't win with fences, then her next move was going to be bigger. And if I'd learned anything about Karen, it was this. The louder the sirens wailed, the louder she screamed. And she hadn't even reached her loudest yet. Karen spent exactly 48 hours in county lockup before her husband scraped together enough for bond. By the time she was back on her porch, she was more dangerous than ever. Not cowed, not apologetic, but emboldened. Her eyes had that glassy zealot look, like she'd discovered a higher calling. If before she'd been playing at being a suburban politician, now she was convinced she was a revolutionary leader. The morning after her release, every mailbox bore a new manifesto, pages this time, stapled and double-sided, written in her breathless, erratic style. The title, The Neighborhood Resistance, Standing Against Federal Tyranny. It wasn't just about the siren anymore. She was spinning it into a full-blown crusade about citizen sovereignty and the unlawful occupation of private communities by faceless bureaucrats. She even quoted the Constitution, out of context, naturally, and promised to restore freedom to our streets. Some neighbors laughed. Others looked uneasy. A few, the ones who always seemed to orbit her drama like moths to a bug zapper, nodded along. But the vast majority? They'd had enough. After watching her get hauled off in cuffs, people weren't buying her freedom fighter act. Still, I knew better than to underestimate Karen. Her power didn't come from reason. It came from her ability to stir chaos. And chaos was contagious. By midweek, her porch had become headquarters. Sharon was back at her side, still loyal despite the midnight bolt-cutter fiasco, and a small group of diehards had assembled. They wore makeshift armbands, literal strips of red fabric, like they were part of some ragtag militia, and patrolled the sidewalk with clipboards, documenting government trespass. It would have been laughable if it weren't so invasive. One of them even had the gall to stand in my driveway and scribble notes until I walked outside and asked if he needed directions to a life. Karen's campaign escalated quickly. She announced she was filing a lawsuit, Karen versus Homeland Security. She called it, as though her name alone carried the weight of precedent. She claimed she had a lawyer lined up. I later learned it was her cousin's paralegal friend who dropped out of law school. She demanded donations from neighbors for her legal defense fund. A few checks trickled in, but most envelopes contained sarcastic notes like, "Here's $1 by some common sense." I could have sat back and enjoyed the slow implosion, but Karen had a way of dragging everyone into her madness. Case in point, the siren itself. After Homeland Security installed the temporary replacement, the county announced plans to upgrade the entire system. Stronger poles, higher wattage, expanded coverage. The new design drawings showed the pole on the same corner, only taller and with a louder speaker array. The news dropped like a bomb. Karen went ballistic. She stormed from house to house with copies of the plans, shrieking that the government was retaliating against her by making the siren even more obnoxious. She posted hourly rants online, each one less coherent than the last. She even staged a protest, her, Sharon, and 3 confused teenagers holding poster boards that read things like "Stop the Sound" and "Our Ears Matter." Meanwhile, Homeland Security wasn't playing games anymore. They'd had enough of her interference. They filed an injunction barring her from approaching the siren or county workers within 50 feet. The neighborhood buzzed with rumors. Was she facing prison time? Heavy fines? Expulsion from the HOA board? Nobody knew. But everyone was watching. The real turning point came one stormy Thursday evening. Dark clouds rolled in, the kind that make the air feel heavy and electric. I was on my porch when the new siren system roared to life in a test, its wail cutting through the storm. It was louder, sharper, impossible to ignore. And just like that, Karen lost it. She ran from her house barefoot, hair whipping in the wind, screaming like the sky itself was conspiring against her. "You will not control me. You will not control this neighborhood," she shrieked, shaking her fists at the siren pole. Lightning flashed overhead, thunder boomed, and there she was, our self-declared general, screaming at the clouds. Neighbors emerged from their homes, some filming, others just staring in stunned silence. It was surreal, watching her rage against the storm while the actual storm raged around her. Her husband tried to pull her back, but she shoved him away and grabbed a garden rake, brandishing it like a spear toward the pole. And then the SUVs returned. Not 1, not 2, 3, headlights slicing through the rain. Agents stepped out, rain slickers gleaming, calm as ever. One raised a megaphone. "Ma'am, step away from the equipment." Karen's response was to hurl the rake at the fence surrounding the siren. It clanged uselessly against the metal. She screamed louder. "This is my land. My neighborhood. You can't silence me." The agents advanced. She fought. Literally fought, kicking, flailing, shouting about tyranny. Sharon tried to intervene, but slipped in the mud and landed flat on her back. The crowd gasped as Karen was finally restrained, her voice cutting through the storm like a banshee. "You'll regret this. Every one of you." She was loaded into the SUV again, soaked, mud-streaked, wild-eyed. This time, the neighbors didn't whisper nervously. They clapped. They actually clapped as Homeland Security drove away, rain pouring, thunder echoing. It was the closest thing to a collective exorcism I'd ever seen. But even as relief washed over the cul-de-sac, I knew better than to think it was over. Karen wasn't just fighting a siren anymore, she was fighting reality itself. And reality has a way of pushing back harder than anyone expects. Sure enough, the very next morning, her husband posted a furious message online. "Karen has been wrongfully detained again. We will pursue justice. Anyone who thinks this is over is mistaken." It was clear he wasn't just parroting her words. He believed them too. Which meant that now, instead of one zealot, we had two. And that, I realized grimly, meant the storm was still building. Because if there's one thing about storms, it's this. The sirens don't go off after the danger has passed. They go off because the worst is still on its way. After Karen's stormfront meltdown and second arrest, the neighborhood should have settled into peace. That's what logic dictated, at least. But logic had never applied to Karen. The very next morning, despite being drenched, cuffed, and hauled off in front of half the cul-de-sac, she was back online, typing furious manifestos from her husband's account. Every post dripped with conspiracy. "Neighbors are collaborating with federal thugs," one read. Another, "The siren is a psychological weapon designed to break our will." She even claimed the government had hacked her sprinklers to flood her garden as punishment. Most of us rolled our eyes. But I knew Karen's playbook by now. Embarrassment didn't slow her, it fueled her. If she couldn't win legitimacy through the HOA, or respect through neighborhood votes, she'd win through intimidation and spectacle. And sure enough, by midweek, she had escalated again. It started with a delivery truck pulling up to her driveway. The driver unloaded crates, wooden, stenciled with odd lettering, and stacked them neatly by her garage. Within hours, she and her husband had tarps strung up, sawhorses out, and drills buzzing. By nightfall, they had built a bizarre contraption, a massive wooden box with holes cut into the sides and wires trailing out like tentacles. She posted online that it was her counter-siren, a community-funded alternative to illegal federal devices. Of course, nobody had funded it but her, but details never mattered to Karen. The next morning, she unveiled it on her lawn with a flourish, as though she were Thomas Edison presenting the light bulb. Sharon clapped like she was watching a Broadway show. Karen plugged in an extension cord, flipped a switch, and the thing emitted the loudest, ugliest screech I'd ever heard. It wasn't a siren. It was a banshee, a dying animal, a rusty engine grinding against itself. Windows rattled. Dogs howled. Children cried. Neighbors stormed out of their homes in fury. "Turn that thing off," shouted one man. "Are you insane?" yelled another. But Karen only lifted her chin. "This is the sound of freedom," she declared. "This is our warning system, uncorrupted by government lies." The irony was breathtaking. She had sabotaged the real siren to stop noise, only to build her own noise machine 10 times worse. Within 20 minutes, police cruisers rolled up. Not Homeland Security this time, just local officers with earplugs jammed in. They ordered her to shut it down. Karen refused, arms crossed, shouting about constitutional rights. When they reached for the plug, she physically blocked it, shrieking like a banshee herself. Eventually, they cut the power at her breaker box. The silence that followed felt like oxygen returning to the cul-de-sac. The officers left her with a citation, shaking their heads. Neighbors muttered angrily, but Karen smiled. She'd achieved what she wanted: attention. I figured that was as far as she could go, but the next twist arrived faster than expected. Homeland Security returned, not for Karen this time, but for the siren itself. The county had fast-tracked the permanent upgrade, and a crew of technicians showed up with cranes, concrete, and a gleaming new siren assembly. They tore down the temporary one and began erecting a 30-foot tower with industrial-grade speakers, the kind that could cut through hurricane winds. The sight of that crane on our street was too much for Karen to handle. She stormed out in her bathrobe, waving her citation like it was a badge of authority. "You have no jurisdiction here," she bellowed. "I am filing an injunction. I forbid this." The workers ignored her. The agents ignored her. The neighbors, by now, openly laughed. She stomped around the crew, snapping photos, shrieking into her megaphone, even lying down in front of the truck until officers dragged her away. But here's where things turned. She wasn't just making noise. She was gathering allies again. Her husband, Sharon, and a handful of neighbors too timid to challenge her outright stood nearby, nodding at her every word. And online, her rants were drawing sympathy from outside the neighborhood. Comments poured in from conspiracy groups, people who believed sirens emitted mind control frequencies or secret data signals. They hailed her as a patriot, and Karen, never one to miss a spotlight, embraced it. She live-streamed the installation, narrating like a war correspondent. "Day 3 of the occupation," she intoned, panning her phone over the crane. "We will not yield to tyranny." By evening, her video had thousands of views. Strangers from out of town even showed up in cars with out-of-state plates, parking on our street, honking in solidarity, waving homemade signs that read things like "Stop the Sound" and "Federal Overreach ends here." Our quiet cul-de-sac had become a circus. Kids couldn't ride bikes without dodging protesters. Delivery drivers refused to come down the block. The neighborhood chat exploded with panic. "This is out of control. Who are these people? Why won't she stop?" Homeland Security didn't ignore it. They dispatched a larger team, more SUVs, more agents, even a liaison from the county emergency office. They spoke to Karen directly, offering her one last chance: cease and desist or face federal charges that carried real prison time. Karen, of course, saw it as proof she was winning. She live-streamed the conversation, cutting the agent's calm explanations into sound bites for her followers. "See how they threaten us?" she cried into the camera. "See how they fear the truth?" By the next day, national reporters were sniffing around. A van with a satellite dish parked at the entrance to our street. A man with a microphone interviewed neighbors. Some called Karen a menace, others a joke, but the footage was gold. A suburban woman raging against a siren, screaming about freedom while agents stood stone-faced nearby. It was spectacle, and the media loved it. That night, the new siren blared its first official test. The sound was clean, powerful, terrifyingly loud. It rolled over the rooftops like a tidal wave. I felt it in my bones. And as soon as it ended, Karen retaliated. She dragged her homemade contraption back out, hooked it to a generator, and let it wail into the night. The clash of sounds was unbearable, the real siren versus Karen's distorted scream box. Windows rattled. Alarms went off in cars. People covered their ears and cursed. The neighborhood was caught between federal warning technology and one woman's crusade of madness. Police arrived first, then federal agent. The crowd of protesters surged, chanting, waving signs, blocking the trucks. And then, predictably, inevitably, it all went sideways. Someone in the crowd lobbed a rock at the siren tower. Someone else shoved an agent. Shouts turned to scuffles. Blue lights flashed. Orders were barked. Suddenly, our sleepy cul-de-sac looked like the set of a riot documentary. And at the center of it all stood Karen, arms raised, screaming, "This is the revolution! We will not be silenced." As agents moved in, I stood on my porch, recording the chaos. My phone buzzed with notifications as videos went viral in real time. Karen wasn't just our neighborhood problem anymore. She had turned into a national headline. And though I hated to admit it, I felt a chill. Because when someone like Karen tastes that kind of attention, they don't stop. They escalate. And if Homeland Security thought this was the climax, they had no idea how far she was willing to drag it. The neighborhood wasn't really a neighborhood anymore. It was a stage. Strangers lined our sidewalks with folding chairs like they were waiting for fireworks. News vans idled at the cul-de-sac entrance. Helicopters buzzed overhead, filming the spectacle of one suburban HOA president turned self-styled revolutionary. Karen had done what no storm, no government agency, and no HOA bylaw had ever accomplished. She had turned our quiet little street into a national circus. The night after the riot-level clash, the air was thick with tension. The new siren tower stood tall, unscathed, its speakers gleaming under floodlights Homeland Security had installed for protection. Karen's contraption sat wrecked in her yard, wires dangling like entrails, after agents finally seized the generator. But Karen herself? She wasn't deterred. If anything, she was vibrating with energy, pacing her lawn like a general inspecting troops, her megaphone in one hand and her phone in the other. She live-streamed non-stop, feeding her growing online following, spinning every event into a story of persecution and martyrdom. Her husband had fully converted to her cause, parroting her rhetoric, posting long screeds about community sovereignty. Sharon, ever loyal, handed out bottled water to the protesters who still lingered. And though the crowd had thinned after the scuffles, enough remained to keep the street buzzing with chants. Down with the siren! Freedom, not fear. The words echoed off the houses, each chant a reminder that Karen had dragged us all past the point of normalcy. I sat on my porch, watching, recording, waiting. Because I knew what Karen didn't. Patience always pays off. The federal agents were patient too. 4 days they held their line. They didn't move in unless someone trespassed. They didn't shout or shove. They just documented, warned, and waited. It was unnerving to Karen, who thrived on opposition she could scream against. Without dramatic clashes, her live streams grew repetitive. She ramped up the theatrics, collapsing on her lawn, weeping about tyranny, wrapping herself in an American flag while screaming at the siren, but even her loyalists started looking bored. And then the weather forecast changed everything. A system was forming, big enough for tornado watches across 3 counties. The very thing the siren was built for was about to be tested. The county announced a full-scale drill. All new sirens would be tested simultaneously, coordinated with phone alerts and weather broadcasts. Homeland Security trucks rolled in with technicians to triple-check the tower's readiness. Suddenly, Karen's antics weren't just noise, they were potential disaster. If she interfered during a storm drill, lives could be at risk. That afternoon, the neighborhood gathered at their windows, watching the technicians work. Karen hovered nearby, screaming insults, calling them storm troopers, waving her arms in the technicians' faces until agents pushed her back. She screamed louder into her livestream. They're staging an event to justify their tyranny. Don't believe their lies. But when the sky darkened, when thunder cracked across the distance and the wind shifted, Karen's rants clashed with something bigger than her ego: nature. The sirens wailed, everyone in the county synchronized. The sound was massive, a wall of noise rolling across rooftops and fields. Inside my chest, I felt it vibrate like a drum. Neighbors emerged from houses, shielding their ears, nodding to each other with relief. The system worked. And then came the moment that ended it all. Karen, defiant to the last, sprinted into her yard with a pair of garden shears. She charged the fence around the siren, screaming, "You will not enslave us!" She jammed the shears at the lock on the gate, trying to break through. Cameras turned instantly, phones, news crews, even a drone overhead. The entire country, it seemed, was watching. Agents swarmed her. She fought like a wildcat, clawing, kicking, spitting. Her husband tried to intervene and was shoved aside. Sharon collapsed into sobs. The shears clattered to the pavement. And in full view of the cameras, Karen was restrained, cuffed, and read her rights. This wasn't a citation. This wasn't a slap on the wrist. This was the endgame. Federal charges, real prison time, obstruction of critical infrastructure during a declared weather emergency. The crowd of protesters fell silent, their chants dying in their throat. Even her online followers, watching through her dropped phone, saw her dragged to the SUV, soaked in sweat, hair wild, screaming incoherently about freedom. The SUVs pulled away. The protesters dispersed like smoke. And just like that, the storm, both the literal one and the one named Karen, passed. In the days that followed, the cul-de-sac was quiet in a way it hadn't been for months. The siren stood tall, unchallenged, a sentinel over our battered peace. Neighbors greeted each other again without fear of being filmed or accused of tyranny. Kids rode bikes down the street. Dogs barked at squirrels instead of protesters. The circus was gone. Karen's house, though, was a different story. Curtains drawn, driveway empty, mailbox overflowing. Her husband vanished into silence, Sharon stopped visiting. Rumors swirled, plea deals, court dates, possible prison. Nobody knew for sure. And honestly, nobody cared anymore. For once, she wasn't the center of our world. One evening, as the sun set and the siren tower cast a long shadow across my yard, I sat on my porch with a mug of coffee and thought about everything that had happened. Karen had believed she could bend reality to her will. That if she screamed loud enough, if she fought hard enough, if she lied convincingly enough, she could make the world play by her rules. But reality doesn't bend forever. It snaps back. And when it does, it doesn't care about HOA titles, petitions, or manifestos. It comes with black SUVs, federal charges, and the cold clang of handcuffs. As I sipped my coffee, a neighbor strolled by and stopped at my gate. It was Mr. Hernandez, the quiet engineer who'd spoken up at the HOA meeting weeks ago. He gave the siren a nod. "Funny," he said. "That thing was meant to warn us about storms. Turns out it also warned us about Karen." I laughed, the first real laugh I'd had in months. "Loud and clear," I said. And with that, life in the cul-de-sac returned, not to normal, because normal had been shattered, but to something better. Quieter. Stronger. Wiser. We'd survived Karen's storm, and now we could finally hear the silence again.